It is Saturday, August 10th, and we're having a conversation today that you've been having all week in your homes. Emotional, confusing. Where's America? Are we on the brink? What is going on? That and much more in this edition of the Armstrong Williams Show. Join us. Zach Halaschak is with the Washington Examiner. Shermichael Singleton is a contributing host of Vox Media. He's considered on Facebook Watch. Rachel Guidace is with the Daily Signal. Ameshia Cross is an SBG contributor. And Devon Smith works for us, Howard Stirk Holdings, I'm proud to say. You know, why is it from El Paso to the Garlic Festival, to Ohio, almost 99.9% of the time that these terrorists, these killers, these assassins are all men, and unusually white men? Should we read something into the fact that there are men that just happen to be white?
Well, I think that's a question a lot of folks are trying to answer, and I don't know if there's a clear-cut answer to it, but there has been some anecdotal, I guess, evidence that would lead people to believe that men, in particular white men, have more access to training with firearms when they're younger. Maybe their father takes them out shooting, compared to women who may not, have that same inclination. Maybe that's a societal thing. Or just kind of a machismo thing.
But are you capable of this because you're white?
No.
Why not?
Because I could not do
Well, tell us why not. Why couldn't you do it?
Because it would destroy, the idea of killing another human in cold blood like that for no reason, just, it sickens me.
So it's not because they're white then?
No.
So then why is it?
I mean, that's the question I think we're all trying to figure out.
Ameshia, help him out.
I think part of the issue is that they have greater access to guns, but the other piece is that in the majority of these cases, there was a very singular line to their violence. Many of these individuals have abused women in the past, and that's one of the key indicators that this person could potentially become a mass shooter in the future. All of them have these records of either abusing women in their schools when they were in middle school, high school, or abusing them in their adult relationships. What we have found is that men who are aggressive towards women have a higher capacity of committing these atrocities.
Well, I think it goes back with serial killers, as an example, which are also predominantly white men. There's a McDonald triad, and there's a characteristic of 3 things that most serial killers can be traced to having done in their childhood and probably into their teens. And I think that it goes the same. There's a character or pattern of behaviors that these men, whether they're white or any race, are exhibiting. And the problem is, just because you have these characters doesn't mean that you're going to be a mass shooter. So how do you stop it? Because you can't arrest someone preemptively. And
so Rachel, so what is the relationship between these men and their mothers?
I think an important piece here that we have to talk about, I mean, men and their moms, that's a relationship that's very important. Also, we have a crisis of fatherlessness here in this country where fathers are not present in the home, and we've seen with the El Paso shooter, his manifesto, he had mental health issues. Last year, the Parkland shooting in Florida on Valentine's Day, that guy, that student, he had social workers, teachers, police in 2 different counties, and family members who had sounded alarms, said there's issues here, and somewhere along the line, people dropped the ball. And so we have a mental health crisis that's coming on here. And when these red flags arise, it's up to people to report them and actually to follow through. And there's been time and time again, people have not followed through with that, and that's why we're seeing this issue here. So it's an important conversation.
Shermichael, does law enforcement share blame?
I mean, I don't think so, and I think this is why it's critically important when you look at what Senator Lindsey Graham is attempting to pass on the Senate side with bipartisan support, that is the red flag laws, which, as the example your guest just mentioned about a recent shooter where you had teachers, you had family members who raised flags about this individual's behavior. If there's a database that exists that showcases each of these instances, then a gun seller, for example, could see if a red flag is raised as they do that immediate background check, I cannot sell this individual a gun. I think it's also critically important for us to invest more money into mental mental illness. Many of these families sort of see signs that their kids, particularly boys, have troubled issues, but they're not exactly sure, how do I deal with this? Where can I go to seek help for my son? So I think it's twofold, Armstrong. Figuring out a way via red flag law so that there's a database that tracks these issues. And number two, empowering families to find the help and seek the mental help that they need for their kids.
Ameshia, your seat is burning.
Red flag laws are being castigated as a one-size-fits-all. At the end of the day, red flag laws are heavily dependent on someone actually reporting a specific behavior. In the majority of cases, this does not happen. Loved ones do not report when there are issues with their children, when there are issues with other people that they care about. They're not reporting a lot of these suicidal thoughts or these actions where, in some cases, you have people who create lists of folks who they want to attack and things like that. They feel like they can handle that at home. They don't report them. Red flag laws exist in 17 states already. It has not been proven that they can stop or prevent any shootings at all. And we'd have to be careful when we talk about mental health, because we have enough people who are already feeling the brunt of a lot of the stigma around mental health issues. Factually, less than 20% of shootings across the country, mass shootings or otherwise, occur by the hands of somebody who has a mental illness.
The other thing we have to think about here is HIPAA, because what are you going to do, violate everybody's privacy to their own medical information? Because for me to know, a doctor can't share with somebody that I'm on psychiatric drugs. That's a violation of my fundamental right with my doctor-patient confidentiality.
And you know, it's
so how do you solve that?
It comes back to freedom of speech. If these killings continue in the manner that they are, because listen, they're not mentally ill. You read their manifesto, they know exactly what they're doing. This is what they want to do, and this is how they want to do it. They're not mentally ill. But if you...
we don't know that, though. I got to push back on that. I mean, we don't necessarily know.
Well, it's his own words. How can you deny the person's own words?
Well, that's just one example. We have no way, there's no quantifiable data that I have seen that's broken down whether or not each of the most recent mass shooters have suffered from a mental illness or not. And I don't think that we should take away from wanting to focus more on this and providing resources into this. A second thing, Ameshia mentioned some of the states that currently do have red flag laws that do exist. The Washington Post recently did a column on this, and what they did find was that these laws do work. When you quantify and look at the readily available statistical analysis that's out there, they do indeed work. To stop people from committing
suicide, not to stop people from actually committing mass shootings.
We don't know that yet.
What they have found is that they have been able, yes, we do know that. Like, NAMI, the National Association for Mental Illness, has actually released this information. They have been found to prevent people from committing suicide via gunshots. They have been proven to do that. They have not been found to do anything to reduce mass shootings at all.
But hold on a second. They've reduced suicide by gunshots, but there's a million ways to commit suicide. So really, what's it doing?
Well,
right? There was just a bunch of stabbings in California. I think he killed 4 people and injured 2 or 6 others. Right? So
and he lives to talk about it. That's the other tragedy in all this.
We can't keep scapegoating people who decide that they want to harm other people because of hate, because of racism, because their daddy got divorced from their mom over and over again, and blame it on the fact that they may have a mental illness. That is a problem. And it is a problem that doesn't exist in urban communities when people get shot every day. Nobody says that the black man shot somebody because he was mentally ill. But when it's a young white man, now we claim mental illness, even though he has no medical record of mental illness.
He's just a bad person.
Let's just take it that he's a bad person who's doing bad things. Just because you or I wouldn't do it doesn't necessarily make another person who does it mentally ill.
Okay, now let me ask you a question. How are we scapegoating that fact? That's what you just said. How?
Because it creates a certain level of sympathy around, and now we need to fund this. And I do think we need to fund mental health and mental health therapies. However, we should not tie that to mass shooters, because there isn't anything within the data that shows us that this is the reason why they're committing these crimes. It's just not there.
Ameshia, that's actually not true. So for my Vox Media program, we were just in Montana about a month or 2 ago, and we talked to some psychologists on this idea of mass shootings as well as suicide. And what they did discover, Armstrong, is that if you do indeed increase funding for psychological treatment for individuals who are depressed or going through other family issues or personal issues, you do not only decrease the likelihood of the individual committing suicide, but you also decrease the likelihood of the individual utilizing that gun to commit horrors in public space, i.e. mass shootings. So again, Ameshia, I'm not sure where you're getting your data from.
Because what you do in these types of conversations, you and others who also make those statements, is attack people like me and others who have grown up without fathers, who have grown up during separations,
who have grown up
up in extreme circumstances and have been depressed or have had anxiety, and now all of a sudden, because those kids attend public schools throughout this country, you are saying that there should be a flag on them because they could potentially turn into killers later. That is not the case, and I'm sorry, I will not stand for anyone who pushes that narrative.
But that's based on your own personal experience.
But it's an important experience.
It's an experience that matters.
It
because
does
at the
matter.
end of the day, you are saying literally that children who have anxiety, young people who have depression issues, people who are going through these things every day have a higher potential to eventually wind up shooting people in mass, and it's just not true.
And on that note, I appreciate that, Ameshia. Experience matters in this country, and we cannot make excuse and use mental illness and more money as a reason to put a red flag on people who are bent on killing and taking lives. I mean, I have no sympathy for these killers. I just don't. My patience has run out. Innocent people's blood is still spilled as a result of us making excuses. But what do we need to do? What can we do to change it? Do we need to take a different look at freedom of speech where you go online and learn how to create a bomb or go out and commit mass shootings? Do we need to roll those back? How far are we willing to go with this? I'm Armstrong Williams. We'll be back. And let me welcome everyone back. This is the other debate that people are having at their coffee tables, their breakfast tables, their dinner tables at work, driving on the cell phone. They seem to think that somehow or another, the President of the United States in the last few years has created this toxic environment where people can go out and beat themselves and just kill and blow people up without any thought. In the first segment, there was no mention of Trump. There was only mention of personal accountability. So let's address the narrative that somehow the president is responsible. We'll start with you, Shermichael.
I mean, I don't think the president is responsible for this. I mean, these are issues that existed way before Donald Trump. Now, can one make the argument that the president does have some culpability in his language, and his language potentially inciting violence, potentially encouraging individuals to commit these acts? And I would certainly say yes. But to place the blame solely on Trump, I would disagree. I think these are issues that are embedded into American culture, and I think we as a society have to address these issues as a whole, whether Trump is president or not.
Zach, where can the president be better?
I think that folks would say he might be more open and conciliatory toward, in particular, he did make in the speech he gave after the El Paso shooting, where the manifesto included, I want to kill Mexicans. Essentially, he did condemn white supremacy and those views. I think, or other folks would say that he could be more forceful in that regard, but. Again, that manifesto in and of itself said that those views predated his presidency. So there's he's put in almost an impossible situation because folks on both sides are going to expect more out of him or less out of him, depending on who you speak with. So, I mean, I don't know if there's any...
But sorry, the people that are expecting more out of him in terms of, they're blaming him and then they expect him to say more or say something differently, are the same people in Hollywood that are releasing a film about hunting down and killing deplorables. So to me, I think the whole argument is ridiculous. And I think it is personal accountability. I think the only person responsible, or people responsible, for the mass shootings are the people who do them. And to blame anybody else is like blaming mental health.
Well, Zach did bring us to where we want to go next in this discussion. We are wonderful at labels. Deplorables, conservatives, black conservatives, liberals. And now we have this new term, white nationalist terrorism. So the question I want to start with Ameshia and Rachel. I'll start with you, Rachel. What is a white nationalist?
I mean, I think these people are people that are essentially basically foregoing every single value we hold as Americans, and they're spewing out these manifestos that they're not American, they're not loving, they're not accepting, they're nothing that America claims to be. And I think we need to totally reject that. And going back to our point earlier of what's happening with this country, why are we turning to these really wrong, un-American things, is we've become a society in a lot of ways that's become very inward. With looking at social media, for example, I'm a millennial, I'm right at the cutoff between Gen Z and millennials, and Vox had a report out last week that said that 22% of millennials say they have 0 friends. And here we are, we're secluding ourselves, we're on social media, we're little keyboard warriors, and we're having these arguments, we're writing these manifestos, these people are turning to white nationalism, where in fact we're missing out on interactions with each other. And we have all of these, quote unquote friends. We have social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and we're connecting in these ways that are not really connecting. And then people are depressed, they're lonely, they're turning to these manifestos and other beliefs that are just completely wrong. And this is so un-American. So, I mean, these shooters who espouse these views, they're not American. They're not anything we aspire to be, and it should be condemned as such, because this is not American, and we reject that. I'm sorry.
Can I just jump in
Sure.
and add? In terms of social media too, I think there's an ability now to kind of be in an echo chamber of people who have those same beliefs and kind of become alienated from reality and from other people. You look at these subreddits, you look at 8chan, other forums where you could go and just be surrounded by hundreds of people who, for example, believe in white nationalism, and that allows those folks to kind of feel like, oh, this is normal. But in the 20, 30 years ago, you'd have to be forced to socialize, go out to a bar, meet people. It's
people
different
found
now.
white nationalist buddies 20, 30, 40 years
yeah.
ago as well. Social media has made it easier. To your question though, white nationalism as a theology is basically the idea that you elevate white culture above all else, and that at the end of the day, this has to be protected by any means necessary. I agree with Devon's point earlier. I don't think that this president was one who created any type of white nationalist agenda. I do think that his language can be detrimental, but he isn't someone who set out to, I think, rise up white nationalism. That has existed in America for a very long time.
But it's inherently un-American, because we're a country that accepts the poor, the needy, the hungering masses yearning to be free. And by espousing that, we're basically rejecting every single view we hold dear. So that's why we as Americans, I reject that. That's completely wrong.
But for people who are hearing that rhetoric, or who have heard it for the course of this administration, hearing the president just this week after a major mass shooting happened come out and denounce white nationalism, they've been waiting for it for months. And now the question is, how far can we take this? Are his actions going to line up with his denouncing of white nationalism?
I saw Shermichael. A young kid was at a rodeo show this week, and before the show began, you sing the national anthem, and someone across from the young kid, who was only about 18 years old, I think he was 17, asked him to take his hat off, and he yelled an expletive at the person. And the person just took his head off and just body slammed him to the cement, and they had to helicopter him to the emergency room. He's fighting for his life. Now that was not about racism. That was also about nationalism. And it played out in a very different way. It was very violent. I mean, do you think we need a civics lesson and what nationalism is? If I decide that I don't want to take my hat off, if I don't want to sing the national anthem, that is my freedom. What is disrespect to you could be freedom to someone else. Where have we as Americans have gotten lost in all this?
I don't know, and it kind of goes back to the idea and kind of the white nationalism, and yes, it's easier for them to find each other with social media. I can hear everything that they're saying, and I'm just never going to agree with it. Just like I'm never going to understand why somebody kneels during the anthem or why someone won't take their hat off. I just don't understand how you can feel that way. And so I don't know what the solution is, because I think that's the problem with a lot of Americans is just take your darn hat off. What's the big deal?
There have been times in this country where I have been so fed up as an African American after seeing police brutality after police brutality, officers not getting arrested, not having to go through our criminal justice system, seeing black men get arrested at rates that are 10 times that of anybody else in this country, and have felt like this country was not serving me a justice as an African American. So I understand when folks are saying, we don't want to stand up and say the pledge because the pledge doesn't honor who we are. It doesn't make us feel American. We have always been treated as less than. So I think that part of that is us expressing the fact that a country has pushed and created laws over time that have made us less than. So I don't think that there is anything that is unpatriotic about somebody expressing that feeling. I think that it is in many ways honorable. For many cases, you can stand and you can have an argument about something that's going wrong, but if that thing continues to go wrong for generation after generation, and the only thing you can do is kneel, then that's what you do. I have yet to see African American uprisings across the country because things are going wrong. I have yet to see us overthrow something, turn into some type of British Tea Party narrative that ended up coming out. We decided to kneel. I don't see that as a major political upheaval. I just don't. And I don't see that as someone being any more un-American than anyone else. That was our way of protesting. And last I checked, protests are very open and honest, and they are things that are protected under our Constitution.
I mean, Armstrong, it's an opinion of some African Americans that kneeling is the best way to do this, but some of the issues that Ameshia just raised are not new. I mean, I can think about Dr. King, I can think about Malcolm X, I can think about the last 150, 200 years, Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, et cetera, that have had to focus on these types of issues, and they found other means to contest them. I think the idea of nationalism has been one that at least one could argue, academically speaking, we have seen diminished over the past 40 to 50 years. I think having love of one's country is not a negative thing. I think when you start talking about ethno-nationalism, where you say, well, because of my race or my racial group and makeup, then I am somewhat superior to other groups, I think that's logically flawed. I think that's problematic. But I do think that as a country, we need to begin to focus again on what does it mean to be an American. The ideals and idealisms that we have upheld that we have not always upheld, that are not always perfect in the way we actualize them through our policies, through our rhetoric, is something to be prideful of, and it is something to work towards. And so I do think that as a country, we need to return back to those values.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you could also be totally against, folks taking the knee and be personally very offended by it. But at the same time, the ability to do so is part of what makes America America, the freedom to do so. So there's almost a sort of, you could argue, nationalistic kind of pride in just seeing that folks are allowed to demonstrate that way. Because then, other countries, they don't have that same freedom.
But isn't that kind of a contradiction? You're dealing because of how much you hate the country and all these things it's done to you. But in another country, if you hated what they done, you could be murdered for that. I mean, it's an honor to be able to kneel because we are in a country where you're allowed to do that.
Exactly.
Rachel,
so it's almost like a contradiction.
In a way,
Rachel, you got the last word because I know we're going to say goodbye to you. So you've got the last word.
We've become a little bit desensitized to the rights and the values that we have, and I think part of what we need to do in this discussion is, again, educate ourselves on what it means to be an American, what it means to love country, but also what it means to appreciate, all those who have came here in search for a better life. And to your point, Devon, it is a contradiction to say, oh, here I'm going to kneel, but then if they were in some other country, really almost a lot of countries in the world, they would not have that right and privilege. So I think that we definitely need to revisit that.
Rachel, it's always a pleasure having you join us, and we'll be back. Don't go away. And welcome back to the show. I want to show you this image. I just want you to take a look at the image. I'm sure it's an image that's going around the world. I thought it was just pretty cut and dry, that it was outrageous. Gives you feelings of back to the days of slavery and the days that America want to forget. But you know what? People come from different perspectives. And I was reading on my Facebook posting today, and this is what someone had to say, because I like to present both sides, because sometimes we can get locked in our own bubble. But this is what the person said to me. Anyone who likens this image to slavery is not thinking straight. Horsemen know it was the best option at that point to take the man to get him help safely. Just because you don't understand horses, don't be so quick to judge.
So first of all, I understand horses because I grew up competing for 20 years. The smart thing to do would have been for the one officer to hand his horse to the other guy, and he could have ponied the one horse, and then he could have taken custody of the gentleman. Period. End of discussion.
And then let me finish. Do you realize, it's the same person to me, how racist you are being today?
Oh, okay.
I have appreciated your thoughtful post until now. Today, you became a liberal wackadoodle racist.
I feel like people have to understand.
People
have to understand what the word racism means. Racism.
And this is Robert Patillo, civil rights attorney. Patillo. Yeah.
Well, look, people have to understand that racism is not simply I disagree with you on something involving race. That's not the definition of racism. Racism is a prejudice somebody holds and the ability to effectuate a negative change in that individual's life. So if you say, I disagree with this person on horseback taking this individual in, and then you fire them because of their race, that is a racist act. Just having a disagreement is not racism. People have to understand and distinguish between those things. And the idea of this not being a racist situation, they would not do this to anybody else. And like you, I grew up in a rural community in Waverly Hall, Georgia. You get off the dang horse. It ain't that hard. You have a radio, you call for backup, and they can drive a car out there or a paddy wagon to pick the person up. The idea you have to take them by horseback through a town looking like it's Jim Crow and segregation is a ridiculous conversation.
Zach, the man was mentally ill.
The man was?
Yeah, Chris Neely, he's mentally ill.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there's really no excuse for it. And I've covered crime, and I know the level, as Robert was saying, of communication between police officers. All it would take was one radio call, even, you know, they all have each other's cell phones, just call down the station, hold them there, detain them. I really just, there's no justification for it whatsoever.
But Ameshia, if law enforcement saw nothing wrong with it, and they are really the standard bearer and the example for society, I mean, what do you expect from other people? I mean, they saw nothing wrong with it until it went viral.
It shows us more about the culture. At the end of the day, we can create as many regulations and stand outside and protest and tweet all day long, but until law enforcement culture changes from within, we're going to continue to see these problems. It shouldn't have taken this incident to go viral for somebody to think, man, this is a really bad idea. This is 2019, not 1897. There is absolutely no reason why you would parade someone, especially somebody who's mentally ill, but anyone at all. You're supposed to be trained specifically, and coming out of a family of police officers, you are trained specifically to work with people who have mental illnesses. There is absolutely no reason why he should have been treated in that inhumane manner.
Why would our reactions would have been different if the man were white and not black?
I think people might have, I think people might have cared less. In the sense that it
but
does
isn't it the same human being? Isn't it about humanity?
And
why should our reactions have been different?
But I think because of the history of slavery. I think it would have affected us differently.
But it's about the dignity of the human being.
You're correct, but context matters. The same thing if you just like Japanese Americans have a different sensitivity to internment than Polish Americans might. That the context and the history of this nation matter, and the fact that this calls for the issue that we need to have more community policing. We need to have police officers that see people in their community as human beings and not simply as the enemy, not simply as criminals. We need police officers who walk the streets and get to know individuals. They should know this is a mentally ill person who needs help and doesn't need to be drugged around by the back of a horse. These are the systemic issues. These are the reason people kneel, because of the need for police reform, because of the need to have and be able to effectuate change. That we don't have those conversations. We get outraged over the image, but we don't get outraged to the point of actually making change.
Shermichael?
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with
No. We've exhausted that.
Okay.
Go ahead. Enough about race and nationalism today.
Okay.
Trump and the trade war, China, the stock market. Is there any end in sight? And does he really understand the consequences of all this?
I mean, I understand that the president's initial premise of this, which is to challenge China on IP, intellectual property, which I think most corporations in this country, most IP attorneys would typically agree with. However, I think this is reaching a point now, Armstrong, where we saw several days ago where the stock market lost over 700 points, the Dow Jones to be specific. That was billions and billions of dollars. That is going to be passed on to the American consumer. Now what we're seeing, China is beginning to lower its currency. It's a currency manipulator, which we know that for a fact, but it's doing it in a way that impacts industries such as the agricultural industry. That's one of Donald Trump's most ardent base of supporters. So I think while the president is doing something that I think we've long-standing had agreement on both sides, meaning Democratic and Republican, as it relates to challenging China on IP and figuring out a way to enforce those laws so that our companies don't see China essentially mimicking many of their products, which we do know, of course, hurts investors. It does hurt the economy somewhat. I think the president is doing something now that, again, most economists would say on both sides, this is not the right decisions to make. It could backfire on the American consumer.
Zach?
Well, I think what's going to be very interesting to see is kind of the slow walking of this process. I don't know if it's just going to keep escalating and ratcheting up in this staccato manner, or I think some analysts, I believe it was at JP Morgan, had thought that the general consensus is that China's kind of waiting to see who wins the next presidential election, because whoever wins that's going to have a big impact on it. So I think it could be a longer, more drawn-out process. And if it does start increasing to a rapid degree and causes some sort of harm to the economy, it'll be interesting to see how the president reacts to that, because in an election year, the economy is what really matters. People's pocketbooks it's what's on the line.
Ameshia, how are we going to stabilize the chaos in Puerto Rico? It's just in terms of the governor, the leadership, the people outraged, the protests, the economy. It's just...
So Puerto Rico has had 3 governors in a week in the span of 7 days. This is a huge problem. Their instability existed before Hurricane Maria in 2017, and it's going to extend long past 2019. Part of the issue there is that in every line of succession, they had some serious political problems. There wasn't a clear person available for them to choose. With that being said, I think that this has raised the level of attention America places on Puerto Rico as a whole, because we needed to know. We needed to know just how bad their government happens to be. We also have to take into consideration that, yes, they are still a part of the United States. This is not something completely separate from us. So their success or failure is also a reflection of the United States as a whole, and that we really need to take part in making sure that their progress actually exists. And part of that, I also think, is looking at and possibly visiting, looking at what's going on with them locally, because from the mayors that exist across cities in Puerto Rico, all of them are corrupt, to the people who are now taking the mantle of the governorship. It is a very difficult situation because there is no shining light available in Puerto Rico right now.
Why is it, do we continue, Robert, to address this issue where the government sends billions of dollars to help people really poor, indigent, and just really rely for their way of life, and just people feel as if it's their money, they steal it, they have no conscience for how other people live, and they assume that someday you just can continue to get away with it and there will not be a day of reckoning. Well, and it's just not just in Puerto Rico.
Well, one, I call Puerto Rico Virginia South, because the same way Virginia had a governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general all go down through corruption, seems the same thing's happening in Puerto Rico. But this actually brings up the case for Puerto Rican statehood, because most Americans do not pay attention to what happens there. After Maria, many Americans had no idea Puerto Rico was part of the vast American empire. We don't know about our territories. We don't know about the voting rights of the individuals who are there. So why not make them part of the country officially? Why not give them the opportunity to participate in our democracy fully, and by that also have the same oversight that other states have, because this wouldn't happen in any other state in the United States of America, because there would be oversight, there would be national outrage, not simple local outrage.
But you just said that it happened in Virginia and it happened in Baltimore, so I have to disagree. I think, yes, Puerto Rico could potentially benefit from statehood, but to say that it doesn't happen in the United States is outrageous.
Well, not to the same. We had national outrage when it happened in Virginia. We had national outrage when it happened in other states.
But did that change anything?
Well,
I think it has changed.
Might have still been there if you were following the Virginia plan.
It's changed the political conversation around the elected officials in Virginia, and it has neutered the ability of Nortman and also of Fairfax to get things done. I think in Puerto Rico, if not for a couple of text messages coming out, this would have went on for another decade probably.
But I think this is a local issue.
And Shermichael, Shermichael, may I say Shermichael?
Sure. Go ahead.
We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back, and we've got to focus on, there was a recent Democratic debate, there's a recent uproar in Baltimore, but Trump moves the media so fast, what happened 2 days ago seems like an eternity 2 days later. We've got to keep up with it, though. We'll be back. You know, it's really funny how the Democratic Party is no longer talking about impeachment. That seems like a century ago. You haven't heard the impeachment word in a long time. For now. But there was a Democratic debate, and what really struck me about the debate is how Senators Booker and Harris decided to dismantle and take on the policies of former President Barack Obama at the expense of his Vice President, Joe Biden. When the polls came out, Senator Harris was polling at 2% of the black vote, Senator Booker was at 1%, and Senator Joe Biden had 32%. There's a lesson there, Ameshia.
Part of it is you can't AKA and have marching bands and think that's going to bring you the black vote. But the other piece, I think, is that they are attacking a legacy of a president who African Americans particularly really appreciated. And we're not even far out of that administration. When you look at it, and they wanted to attack Biden, and they thought that the easiest way to do it was to go through his most recent policy initiatives nationally, they did not expect the blowback for also attacking the head of those policy initiatives, Barack Obama. Coming out as one of the strongest Democratic presidents with the highest approval rating in recent history, that was not the smartest thing for them to do. And they were already polling really low with African Americans to begin with, which is ironic considering they're the only two black candidates.
You know, Zach, Joe Biden has been disastrous in this debate format, just disastrous. And he still continues to do well. What does it say about everybody else in the field?
I think it says that most folks in the country don't necessarily, they want some stability maybe. They want some, a familiar face, someone they know.
So old white male.
Exactly.
So why not somebody who could possibly defeat Trump?
Yeah, and I think I think that is part of it too. I think that Biden has somewhat more of an appeal because he's not as out of left field as some of the other candidates like Warren and Sanders. And so I think that everyone's kind of trying to pile on and attack Biden because they do see him as the front runner now. Will that be the case a week from now, a month from now, 3 months from now? Who knows? But
so how do they balance this?
Well, one, let's understand. Do you know who watches debates the August before an election year in the middle of the week before school starts?
I don't.
Political nerds. Those are the only people who watch it. So when you're doing these polls, it's just name recognition. Do you recognize the name Joe Biden? Oh yeah, that's Obama's granddad. So that's why Biden will stay this high in the polls. So as the field comes down, we got some lady selling magic crystals in the corner. We got a guy giving away money over here. We got like some white guys that nobody can recognize. Once we get down to 4 or 5 candidates around October after Labor Day, that's when we'll start seeing the field come together and we'll start seeing a real contest and question of ideas. Right now, when you have 30 seconds to answer a question on how are you going to fix healthcare, 30 seconds, we're not getting a real debate. This is all an entertainment product right now as opposed to being an actual substantive debate.
I do think you're right, and it is comical and fun to watch, but I think there is some truth to something that I think we've all probably thought, and probably I think you'll agree with, is that most of the Democratic Party isn't well represented by the fringe, and Joe Biden appeals to a larger majority of the party. And I think he would even appeal to some conservatives that might be frustrated with Trump because he's not that fringe left that terrifies the right. And so that's the problem.
Shermichael, what about the most recent ads that are running attacking the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell?
Moscow Mitch.
Moscow
I mean, look,
Mitch.
Armstrong, Mitch McConnell is by far the most effective majority leader, I would argue, in the history of the United States Senate. Under his leadership, Republicans have appointed over 100 federal judges. Most of those folks would be there for at least 40 to 50 years. They will dictate the course of this country, legally speaking. And Robert, as an attorney, could speak to this more than I can. But to go back to Democrats, if I can, quickly attacking Joe Biden, when you look at the breakdown of the polling numbers in key electoral states, battleground states, Iowa, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, even Florida, for example, Joe Biden polls very well, not just with a majority of Democrats, but also GOP-leaning independents. When you further break it down and look at the exit results from 2016, the margins by which President Trump won some of those states, 10,000 votes, 44,000 votes. Those are not significant numbers, and he won in part because there was a decrease in turnout among key constituencies that Barack Obama was able to turn out in 2000 in both terms that Hillary Clinton was not able to turn out. Joe Biden, though, however, does show the ability to turn those numbers out. So I think for most Democrats, they're looking at someone who can defeat Donald Trump. When you look at African Americans, so your question on why Kamala Harris is polling at 1% within the margin of error, why Cory Booker isn't polling at all, it's in part because when you ask African Americans what's most important to them, they will say it's not gender, it's not race, it's replacing Donald Trump, and all of those things benefit Vice President Biden.
So, speaking of President Trump, I'm going to give the president a little love here, okay? I really like the fact, in some cases, when he makes up his mind, it's the right thing to do. There are many within the White House, and especially in Ohio and El Paso, who did not want him to go and pay homage to the people who died for no reason at all. And I really respected the El Paso mayor when the media tried to put her in a trick bag to condemn the president. She said, look, he's not coming here for political reasons. He's the president of the United States. He brings resources and economists that we need. After all the frustration for her to rise above and put America first. And one of the things that we don't talk about enough is how the media is the energizer of these candidates and set them up to criticize this president. And it leads to so much divisiveness. And you know why they never had a report yesterday about after his visit? Because it went well. There were not the protests, there was not the anger, there was not the spit and profanity that they wanted. It just did not happen. And so when it goes dark, that means the president's visit was a success. And it should have been. Sometimes the media does this country and the candidates a grave disservice. Zach?
No, I certainly agree with you on that. I do think part of the reason there wasn't maybe as much details about what went on in those two cities. Was the press was not allowed at some of those events at the hospital, for example, in Dayton. But I do think that the media does like to stoke outrage over President Trump. Because I think it all comes back to clicks, page views. It's what sells. People want to be outraged in the United States. Unfortunately so. They would much rather, even though they won't necessarily admit it, they'd much rather read an article that is all spicy and gets them all worked up than one that's, you know, talking about conciliatory themes and less controversial issues. So I think it's kind of a two-fangled problem, both with the media and the public's obsession with this kind of outrage.
You know, Robert, and yet the media, the Democratic candidates turned their fire on the New York Times for a headline about Trump because they felt he was not condemned enough in terms of his stoking the fears in this country, and yet they're dissatisfied with the media.
Well, let's understand the media has turned into an entertainment product. Right now, there's very little difference between the major networks and TMZ when it comes to news, except TMZ's right more often than the major networks are, quite frankly. And with the Democratic candidates, when you say the Democratic candidates, we're talking about people who are at 1% in the polls. So these are people who are looking for any headline. I did find it distasteful for some of the candidates to use this as an excuse to get free airtime, for some of the candidates to realize that all they have to do is say Trump is a racist, and then CNN and MSNBC will huddle around them. They get a whole bunch of advertising they would have otherwise not gotten. We should be able. Yeah, we're talking about Beto and Tim Ryan. But we have to be in a place and a position in this country where we can separate the campaign, which seems to be everlasting, from the governing side of things. We need to have a situation where the president can come together with leaders in the House and leaders in the Senate and pass some dang legislation that will stop us from having some crazy white dude shooting up the whole country every 3 or 4 weeks. I think that's what most Americans do, and the best way you can get elected president is to do that.
Well, I don't think you're going to pass any legislation to stop that, and we'll be back. You know, one of the most difficult books I've ever read in my life was Beloved. I read it when it first came out. I had a chance to sit down with Toni Morrison for an interview, and just such a warm and wonderful person. And Shermichael wrote a piece that's going to run in the Washington Examiner on Tuesday, and I thought it was a wonderful piece. I just wanted to celebrate, really, an icon. Toni Morrison. Shermichael?
I mean, Armstrong, you know, I was actually supposed to meet Toni Morrison last year, the fall of last year. And unfortunately, I was not able to because her health did begin to decline last year. But you know, Armstrong, as I was writing that piece and I was thinking about many of her novels, she wrote a total of 11 many essays. She was a cultural critic. She focused on race and identity. I began to think about something that Maya Angelou said about words and the power of words. And she said, wouldn't it be something if we could actually measure the meaning of words and their impact, whether that's negative or positive? And in thinking about Toni Morrison, I thought about how many generations of individuals, how many students she taught at Princeton University, Howard University, and other institutions across this country that are impacted by this incredible woman. She was the first African-American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize for any category. She was the first African-American woman to be a book editor at Random House, which is one of the largest book editing companies in the country today. And so when you look at how remarkable her life was and the awards that she won, but also the impact, I think it just can never be understated, particularly on matters of race, Armstrong. She talked so profoundly on race, and I really think what Toni Morrison attempted to do through her writings and also through her life was to try to move the needle in a way where individuals understood that what you see on the outside is not what should divide us. And that's a very, very minuscule thing, as she said in one of her interviews 2 years ago. She said, race means nothing. It's a social construct. She said there's only one race. That's the human race. And I found that to be extremely profound.
You know, I want to celebrate her life. Much respect. She certainly left the world far better than she found it. And I'm going to place an incredible task on our panel before we say goodbye today. It's such an uplifting note to hear about Toni Morrison. Tell us something good that has happened this week that has gone underreported that you wanted to tell America about. We want to end it on that note. Zach, we're going to put you on the spot and start with you.
Yeah, I actually, I mean, it's been a rough week having to cover, because I do breaking news, so it's covering lots of stories all at once, and pretty much all week it's been about the shootings. I had the privilege to write about a man in New Jersey who was mentally disabled, had lost all of his family. 5 years ago, his father had died. His mother died before that. His brother died a year after his father died, and he was living alone. And he very severely mentally disabled, has the cognitive functions of essentially a preteen. But all of his neighbors, he brings in the mail for them. He helps them clean around the house, cook. He goes to meals with them. It's like he calls them his family. And I guess he had a lien against this house and owed $50,000 or so in debt. That neighborhood rallied around, and they all collected that money through a viral campaign on GoFundMe. And this gentleman now has a place to live, and he can stay in his home with his family, which really is his family, even though they're not related by blood. And that just was an honor to write that and to hear about the story of that.
Devon?
Gotta give me more time.
That is sad.
I know.
That is so sad.
So sad, but it's so true. Go to Ameshia.
It's been a long and sad week, but I'd probably say one of the shining stories was Centonia Brown being released from prison in Tennessee. She's been there for quite some time. Now she is getting to jumpstart her life again. She got a degree while she was there. She's engaged. She's going to be married soon, and I think that it's great that she gets to start her life over.
Robert?
Baltimore strong. I love seeing the way the city has come together
after
after everything that's gone on and that has happened the last couple of weeks. You know, you got Uruguay issuing a travel advisory telling people not to travel to Baltimore now. But seeing the community come together, seeing small businesses pop up, seeing people's cleaning neighborhoods, not letting the stereotypes, not letting what everyone else says about them impact them, and making the city stronger. I think that's a positive.
Well, I
come out this
think
week.
they gathered up like 12 tons of trash in a couple of hours.
Yeah.
I mean, which is, well, can't imagine what that even looks like.
You know, it's really sad when we're so overwhelmed by the negative. As someone who's a veterinarian, you cannot find a good story. It's just a sad commentary.
And then I was like, oh, right, the Baltimore stuff, and then
it's just a sad commentary. And there are a lot of people that way.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of good news. The Bible tells us, find something good and praise it. You know, we're starting something new, our poll questions. We're asking these questions at the end of the show, and we're hoping that our listeners and watchers will respond. And the poll question today is, by taking military weapons out of homes and off the streets, wouldn't that make it 10 times harder for perpetrators to conduct mass shootings? That's our poll question today. Either yes or no. It's possible. That's what we want you to answer. And look, it's been wonderful having this discussion today. And what it reminds us is that America, Devon, we have a lot to be thankful for. And just because the headlines about blood and mass killings, there's still a lot of good that everyday Americans put forward in this country every day, Ameshia.
Absolutely.
Devon?
No, I mean, I agree. I think we have a lot to be thankful for. I will always be proud to be an American.
You don't have a good animal story for us from the veterinary? I want to get something out of you. I got about 30 seconds.
Think about it.
I keep trying.
No, it was actually a sad week at the hospital. Believe me, we don't want to get into it.
Oh, well, anyhow. Well, listen, thank you all so much for joining us for this edition of the Armstrong Williams. Remember, this show repeats tonight at 11:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. You can watch our strong cast. You can go to our website, www.armstrongwilliams.com. And our Twitter handle is at @ARightSide. Join us for another edition of the show next week, same time, same place. Have a great weekend, everybody.